door swung open. It wasn't a slam or a creak, just a smooth, deliberate push, as if whoever had entered knew they weren't exactly welcome but didn't care. My husband looked tense, rubbing the back of his neck before stepping aside to let someone through. "Hey," he muttered, barely meeting my eyes. A young man, tall and lean, stepped into the doorway, no older than 20. Tousled hair, a suitcase in hand, and a slight, almost cocky smirk on his lips. It immediately put me on edge. "I hope you don't mind," my husband said, his voice strained. "He's going to stay with us for a while." I set my glass down, trying to mask my irritation. "A heads up would have been nice," I said, keeping my tone even. "I was going to tell you," my husband shrugged. "But things happened." He turned to the young man. "Go ahead, make yourself at home." I watched as the man stepped inside, eyes scanning the house like he hadn't seen it in years. It had been years since he left, but I remembered him. Back then he was just a quiet boy. Now he was someone entirely different. The first few days felt off. He was polite, kept to himself, but his presence was impossible to ignore. My husband had grown distant, his late nights at work becoming more frequent, his excuses more hollow. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, it felt like he was somewhere else entirely. I told myself it was just stress, that things would get back to normal soon. But the tension in the house was palpable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The young man, always present but never intrusive, seemed to find ways to be around. He'd help with the groceries before I could, fix little things around the house. Subtle, unnoticed acts that made me feel like my world was shifting out of my control. I didn't know whether it was intentional or not, but it unsettled me. One afternoon he was standing by the sink, rinsing dishes with quiet ease. When I reached for a towel, our hands brushed. It was barely a touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled away too quickly, heart pounding. He didn't react, didn't smile, didn't say anything, but I felt it. A shift. Something I couldn't explain. That night I found myself alone in the living room, the house too quiet, the weight of silence pressing in. I'd been distracted all evening, unable to shake the strange tension that had been building between us. The movie played on, but my mind was elsewhere. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but the stillness of the room, the warmth of the blanket, lulled me into a doze. I woke up suddenly, feeling the unmistakable presence of someone standing near me. My heart raced as I blinked through the haze of sleep. There he was, standing just inches away, his gaze fixed on mine, unreadable. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said quietly, his voice low, smooth. I tried to sit up, disoriented, but something about this moment, the closeness, felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. "It's fine," I murmured, but the words felt hollow. He didn't step back. Instead he stood there, just close enough to make my skin prickle. As I moved to adjust myself, our hands brushed again, this time longer, more deliberate. Time stretched thin, and before I could pull away, his lips brushed mine, just the faintest, briefest touch. I froze, my chest tight, unable to pull back in time. It was a mistake, a slip, but it felt like everything I had been trying to ignore crashing down in that single moment. We both pulled away quickly, no words spoken, the weight of it hanging between us like a cloud. He exhaled sharply and walked away, leaving me wide awake, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what had just happened. The next morning I tried to push the kiss to the back of my mind, pretending it didn't happen, but every glance felt charged with unspoken words. It was impossible to shake the feeling that everything had changed. Just when I thought I might be losing my grip on reality, an unexpected message brought a wave of discomfort. My old friend, the one I hadn't heard from in years, was back in town. We had once been inseparable, but things drifted when she left without explanation. Now she was standing in front of me again, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was different about her. She looked the same, sharp eyes, confident smile, but there was a layer beneath the surface that unsettled me. Our conversation started easily enough, reminiscing about old times, but as the minutes passed, her questions became more pointed. "So, how's your life now? Your husband?" she asked, her gaze lingering. "And the boy who's back? How's he adjusting?" I stiffened. "Why are you so curious about him?" I tried to keep it light, but there was something in her smile that made me uneasy. "Just curious," she said, but I wasn't buying it. The conversation had taken a strange turn, and I was left with a knot in my stomach, unsure of what was really happening. Later, when I introduced her to my husband, I noticed the warmth between them, a familiarity I hadn't expected. His hug lingered just a bit too long, and when she turned to meet the young man's eyes, something passed between them, something that left my pulse racing. They knew each other and they weren't telling me how. I had hoped the strange interactions with my old friend and the young man would fade into the background, but they only seemed to grow louder, more apparent. To regain some sense of control, I decided to focus on my marriage. I arranged a quiet, romantic evening for my husband, wanting to reconnect, to remind us, of the bond we once shared. I cooked his favorite meal, lit candles, and played the music we used to listen to when we were carefree. When he arrived, I tried to ignore the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, how his focus seemed to drift elsewhere, the conversation lacking its usual warmth. I told myself it was just stress, that we were both just tired, but deep down I knew it was more. The evening felt forced, as though we were playing parts we no longer remembered. But when I reached across the table to touch his hand, there was a flicker. Something familiar, something that made my chest tighten. "You seem distracted," I murmured, my hand still resting on his. He squeezed my fingers but quickly pulled back, his smile not quite right. Later, when we sat together on the couch, I closed the space between us, leaning in to kiss him. His lips were warm, but there was an unfamiliar hesitation. His kiss, though familiar, felt distant, like he was holding something back. Just as I felt the spark of something real, his phone buzzed sharply on the table. Without thinking, I glanced down. The message was short but devastating. "I'm waiting for you." My breath caught in my throat, fingers tightening around his shirt as I realized it was her name at the bottom of the message. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My suspicions had been growing ever since my husband's strange behavior started, and now the message had confirmed it. I needed to know the truth. That night I decided to follow him. He said he needed some time to clear his head, a vague excuse I had heard one too many times. I grabbed my keys, slipped out quietly, and followed him, my heart hammering in my chest. He parked at a small restaurant on the edge of town. I parked far enough behind to avoid being seen, but close enough to see him walk inside. My stomach twisted as he approached her, my best friend. She was already waiting, her smile too wide, her manner too familiar. I stayed hidden in the car, but I could see the way she leaned in, touching his arm, speaking to him in that quiet way she had, her fingers grazing his wrist. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. The tension was palpable. Then, just as I expected, her expression shifted, her voice rising enough for me to catch a few words. "You need to tell her." His response was low, his jaw clenched. "No. She doesn't need to know." That was all I could take. My mind spun, questions flooding my thoughts. The world felt dizzying, as if everything was turning upside down. I returned home in a haze, but when I walked inside, the young man was standing in the doorway, his gaze steady, his eyes unreadable. "You seem distracted," he said, voice low, a smirk pulling at his lips. I could feel the weight of his words before he even finished. "You know this is wrong," he murmured, stepping closer. "But you like it." My pulse stuttered. He wasn't wrong, and the realization made my chest tighten. Everything I had been avoiding was crashing in on me. The house felt like a prison now. The walls were closing in on me, the silence between my husband and me unbearable. I needed answers, but when I asked him directly, his face went blank. "Tell me the truth," I demanded, my voice trembling. His eyes flickered, and for a moment I thought he might say something real. But instead he looked away, then met my gaze again and muttered, "I've seen her, yes, but there's nothing between us." His words hung in the air, but they didn't land. I couldn't believe him, not after everything. Not after the way he'd looked at her when she walked into this house, like they shared a secret. My heart raced as I forced myself to face him, to demand the truth. He looked defeated, like he couldn't even keep up the lie anymore. I thought about reaching out to my old friend, trying to get the full story, but when I did, her tone was defensive. "You're imagining things," she said too quickly, but I could hear it. The crack in her voice. The guilt. She was hiding something. Then there was him, the young man, always there, always watching. His eyes were too intense and his presence too constant. He never said anything, but I could feel the tension whenever he was near. And then his words echoed in my mind. "You know it's wrong, but you like it." He wasn't wrong. I felt it. I was caught in a web, unsure of how to break free. Every step I took felt like it led me deeper into a trap I had walked into willingly. The damage was done, and there was no way to take it back. I couldn't avoid it any longer. The weight of everything between us had been suffocating. The tension, the unsaid words, the strange pull I felt whenever he was around, it had all come to a breaking point. That night I made up my mind. I had to face him and figure out what was happening between us. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall, the room heavy with silence. I walked in trying to steady my breath, but I could feel my heart pounding. I sat beside him, the space between us palpable, like we were both trying to figure out if we could still make sense of this. "I need to know what's going on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me. For a moment, there was only the sound of his breath. Then, without warning, he leaned in, closing the distance between us. His lips brushed mine, soft but deliberate, a moment that felt too long in the making. I froze, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. But just as the kiss deepened, the door swung open and there he was, my husband. He didn't say a word. His gaze met mine, dark and heavy with accusation. His eyes burned through me, and for a second the world seemed to stop. He didn't need to speak. His silence was deafening. I wanted to explain, but the truth was too clear. The moment I had been trying to deny had arrived. I had no escape. I had let myself get caught in a game I didn't even understand, and now I had to face the consequences. The silence after he walked in was suffocating. My husband didn't yell, didn't throw accusations, but his gaze was sharp, cold, cutting through me like a blade. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move as I sat there, my lips still tingling from the kiss. His eyes flickered from me to the young man, and then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, every step heavier than the last. The door slammed behind him, and with it, the last shred of hope that I could somehow undo the mess I had created. The house was now quieter, emptier, as if the very walls knew that something had broken, something that couldn't be fixed. The young man, he didn't say anything either. He stood there, his face unreadable, like he had no stake in any of this. He just watched me, his eyes steady, as if this was all part of some plan he knew better than I ever would. My stomach churned with guilt, but also something darker, something that made me question myself. I tried to reach out to my husband, tried to apologize, but he was gone. The door had closed behind him, and I was left alone with the consequences of everything I had done. My best friend had vanished from my life just as quickly as she had entered it. No calls, no messages. It was like she had never existed, leaving me with only questions unanswered and unresolved. The young man continued with his life as though nothing had changed, as if I was the one who was lost. But I had walked into a trap of my own making, and now there was no escape. I could only stand there, paralyzed, watching everything I knew fall apart. The house felt hollow, the silence unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything that once made this place home. My husband had left without a word, taking the last bit of warmth with him. The door closed softly behind him, and I was left standing there, unable to move. Hours later, the young man left too, slipping out just as quietly as he had arrived. He didn't say goodbye, didn't give any explanation. He just left, and with him went any hope of fixing what I had broken. I stood in the middle of the living room, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. The echoes of laughter, the soft hum of everyday life that had once filled the house, were gone now, replaced by a stifling stillness. I had walked into this, unknowingly at first, but now I realized how much I had lost. My choices had led me here, and there was no turning back. I stumbled into the hallway, my eyes falling on an old photograph. One of those rare moments of happiness when we were all together. I remembered how we had been. A family, whole, smiling, before everything had unraveled. But that was before. Now I knew what I had lost, and the thought of what I could have had made the loss feel even more painful. I was left alone with the consequences, with nothing but the wreckage of my own making. The life I had once known was gone, and no matter how much I wished, it would never come back.